to our webinar today.
Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar.
We're amazed at the sheer number of you joining this webinar, as over 2,000 people are registered.
I hope you enjoy it and you may learn something from it. But not everybody grieves like that.
I agree with what Pat said as well. People do grieve in different ways.
Because it's not an easy subject to talk about.
I really hate that D word. I hate it.
I knew then that she wasn't going to get better.
And Carol died. She took her last breath. And there was a silence in the room, and
well, we knew that Victoria was going to die, and we knew we had time to prepare for this.
And then we said, and then I have to ask you, should or shouldn't we resuscitate your daughter? This was so unexpected for me, that question.
At 33, from constipation, he died. I wailed like a wounded animal.
That beautiful smile, that sense of humour, and those wise words of wisdom, they were gone forever. My boy was silenced.
Not only are they at high risk of catching the virus, because they catch it, they're at very high risk of not getting the care that they need. We need to have the vaccine immediately.
How has it been for you, seeing people dying of COVID?
You just spoke about your father dying. I'm really sorry about that. You know, it must have been very, very hard for you.
I do think you're brilliant. I think that you should be really proud of everything that you've done this year, because you've managed to help teach the rest of us what we should be doing. So
we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.
I hope you found it useful.
I hope to see you again next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
I think people with a learning disability should get the vaccination, because it will. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Sorry. Oh. I don't know. Just. Yes. Oh. It's a good thing. I'll call him back. Sorry.
Welcome to our webinar today.
Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar.
We're amazed at the sheer number of you joining this webinar, as over 2,000 people are registered.
I hope you enjoy it and you may learn something from it. but not everybody grieves like that.
I agree with what Pat said as well. People do grieve in different ways.
Because it's not only the subject to talk about.
I really hate that D word. I hate it.
I knew then that she wasn't going to get better.
And Carol died. She took her last breath. And there was a silence in the room, and
well, we knew that Victoria was going to die, and we knew we had time to prepare for this.
And then you said, and then I have to ask you, should or shouldn't we resuscitate your daughter? This was so unexpected for me, that question.
At 33, from constipation, he died. I wailed like a wounded animal.
That beautiful smile, that sense of humour, and those wise words of wisdom, they were gone forever. My boy was silenced.
Not only are they at high risk of catching the virus, but once they catch it, they're at very high risk of not getting the care that they need. We need to have the vaccine immediately.
How has it been for you seeing people dying of COVID?
You just spoke about your father dying. I'm really sorry about that. You know, it must have been very, very hard for you.
I do think you're brilliant. I think that you should be really proud of everything that you've done this year, because you've managed to help teach the rest of us what we should be doing. So
we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.
I hope you found it useful.
I hope to see you again next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
I think people with a learning disability should get the vaccination, because it will. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Sorry. Oh. I don't know. Just. Yes. I think it. Oh. It's a good thing. I'll call him back. Sorry.
Welcome to our webinar today.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar.
We're amazed at the sheer number of you joining this webinar, as over 2,000 people are registered.
I hope you enjoy it, and you may learn something from it.
But not everybody grieves like that.
I agree with what Pat said as well. People do grieve in different ways.
Because it's not only the subject to talk about.
I really hate that D word. I hate it.
I knew then that she wasn't going to get better.
And Carol died. she took her last breath. And there was a silence in the room, and
well, we knew that Victoria was going to die, and we knew we had time to prepare for this.
And then you said, and then I have to ask you, should or shouldn't we resuscitate your daughter? This was so unexpected for me, that question.
At 33, from constipation, he died. I wailed like a wounded animal.
That beautiful smile, that sense of humour, and those wise words of wisdom, they were gone forever. My boy was silenced.
Not only are they at high risk of catching the virus, because they catch it, they're at very high risk of not getting the care that they need. We need to have the vaccine immediately.
How has it been for you seeing people dying of COVID?
You just spoke about your father dying. I'm really sorry about that. You know, it must have been very hard for you.
I do think you're brilliant. I think that you should be really proud of everything that you've done this year, because you've managed to help teach the rest of us what we should be doing. So
we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.
I hope you found it useful.
I hope to see you again next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
I think people with a learning disability should get the vaccination, because it will. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Sorry. Oh. Yes. It's a good thing. I'll call him back. Sorry.
Welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch. I'm Peter Allen.
And I'm Irene Toff-Rivijnen. Very good to see you back. And wasn't it amazing, Peter, to see all the things the PCPLD network has done this year? If you've missed it, we will show that again at the end of today. Now, before we start this afternoon's plenary session, we have some wonderful posters for you. And we'll make those posters available to you all. But in the next 15 minutes, you can hear the presenters talk about them as well. That's Sarah Helton, Tina Morris, and Sarah Jeremila Fernandez, and Sue Marston. Let's look at these wonderful posters.
My name is Sarah Helton, and for over 25 years I've worked in the field of special educational needs, specialising in teaching children with severe and profound and multiple learning disabilities. And last year I began studying for a PhD at Kingston University. Many of the schools that I have worked in have sadly experienced pupil deaths, and early in my career I became aware of the lack of support for these young people, and also the lack of awareness that those children with severe and profound and multiple learning disabilities were actually affected by grief and needed to be supported. Until the 1990s, it was generally believed that individuals with learning disabilities were incapable of understanding the concepts of death and therefore were incapable of being affected by grief. Thankfully, since then, this research has been challenged, most notably by the work of Maureen Osborne, and the research has shown that adults with LD do experience grief. The majority of this research focused on adults with mild and moderate learning disabilities. The needs of children with LD, and particularly those with SLD and PMLD, have been overlooked. This literature review sought to answer the question, how do children with severe or profound and multiple learning disabilities communicate grief? And that was grief due to any reason, not necessarily as a result of bereavement. It quickly became apparent that there was a scarcity of literature and that I needed to look beyond the world of children with LD. So I undertook a scoping review going across 12 databases to discuss how the following three populations communicate grief. Those populations were children with LD, adults with LD, and neurotypical children. How do they communicate their grief, and can this help us to understand how children with SLD and PMLD communicate grief? The literature concerning grieving children and adults with LD included all forms of LD, mild to profound, but the vast majority of this literature did involve cases with mild and moderate LD. The results showed that there are many similarities in how grief is communicated by each of these three populations, and this can be summarised as communicating grief verbally, where that was possible, non-verbally, creatively, and through another form of communication. For adults and children with LD, this was by use of augmentative and alternative communication, and neurotypical children, it was the use of timeout cards and homeschool contact books. All individuals, neurotypical and those with learning disabilities, made use of behaviours, facial expressions and body language to communicate grief. Although there were very few studies involving children with SLD or PMLD, most notably there was the work of Hannah Young and Pamis, they did demonstrate that young people do experience grief when they have SLD or PMLD. I began my PhD wondering if it was the communication difficulties of these children that was the barrier to them receiving grief support. Maybe we need to teach the children other ways of showing their emotions, teach them more vocabulary about grief. Communication difficulties can be a barrier to individuals with LD communicating grief, but this literature review has shown that even when an individual has no formal means of communication and is considered to have severe or profound learning disabilities, they still have ways of showing us that they are grieving. Through their changes in behaviour, through their changes in sleeping and eating patterns, by their vocalisations, by their movements. Therefore, rather than thinking about the child's barrier to communicating grief, perhaps we should instead be considering those who are supporting these children are the barriers. What is stopping these people from seeing, hearing, understanding and accepting and responding to the communication that these children are displaying? Much of the research discussed that this is often as a result of a lack of training. Adults supporting children with SLD and PMLD need to develop their skills of understanding that grief and bereavement affects us all. They need to develop their skills to have conversations with these young people. Without a skilled and willing communicative partner, the grief that a child with SLD or PMLD communicates will fall on deaf ears. The lack of a skilled and willing communicative partner has emerged as a highly significant barrier and one that requires further research.
I'm Tina Morris and I'm the Practice Development Nurse at St Joseph Hospice, and this is to tell you about our poster, Finding and Closing the Gaps. The poster explains how we realised that there were gaps in our knowledge and training when caring for people with learning disabilities. And we've tried to explain how we've readdressed this over the last 2.5 years. So first of all, narrowing the gap through a contact, I was able to get in touch with a local LD specialist nurse in the local Islington team. And she was willing to give us plenty of time talking through the resources that we might need, signposting us to local resources, and also helping with the workshop and training material that we were going to use. And from this, a colleague and myself were able to put on an hour-long workshop. And you can see from the poster that we had very good evaluations, so we didn't need to change any of the content. And we've rolled that out over the last sort of year, 18 months. Even with COVID, we've managed to get small groups of nurses to attend But from that, we were able to see that there was lots of experience within our nursing team, either personal or they'd worked with learning disabilities in the past. And we wanted to be able to use that to try and plug the training to clinical practice gap that quite often happens. And one of the suggestions was a ward-based champions group, which we managed to get together. There are 6 nurses from both of the inpatient wards, and they are there as a resource to try and ensure that practice is as best as it can be if we have someone with a learning disability coming to the inpatient unit. They wanted to wear badges, which I have here, to signpost people that they could help and support, and we are called LD Friends, which you'll see a picture of us in the poster. And actually, quite recently, there was a clinical impact where we had a member of a patient came in and with a profound learning disability, and we were able to put in practice some reasonable adjustments and to individualise care. So firstly, we allocated extra time for his care, and we were able to give him a side room until he got used to staff and being in the clinical environment. We were able to offer him a smart speaker so he could listen to music that he liked, provide him with the right drinks that he liked, and provide him with a large clock so he could see the time, because that was one of his things that he needed to know what was happening and at what time. And so that impact really was a positive experience for staff. We even got very good impact and evaluation from his sister, who said that he was really happy here and the staff were wonderful, which was a great feedback for us. So continuing on, we want to try and close the gap even more. We're trying to ensure that we work with local boroughs, Tower Hamlets, Newham and Hackney, in their LD teams to try and help with that transition from perhaps community care into hospice care, also involving our own community team here. And hopefully next year we want to raise awareness for the whole hospice with a Learning Disability Awareness Day. So things are coming together and we are eventually closing the gap.
The St Wilfrid's Hospice Eastbourne Mind the Gap project. Hi, I'm Sue Marsden, End-of-Life Care Facilitator at St Wilfrid's Hospice. Our project has been funded under the Widening Access Grants from Hospice UK and has been running for just over 6 months. Our aim is to work alongside hospice and learning disability colleagues to improve access to end-of-life care for people with learning disabilities in our community. We know that people with learning disabilities die younger than their non-learning disabled peers, are more likely to die in hospital, and are less likely to die under the care of a hospice team. Whilst some illnesses in people with a learning disability may well be amenable to better care, thus improving quality and quantity of life, we have to acknowledge that everyone dies one day and do more to support people with a learning disability to access timely end-of-life care. I've been in post since February 2021, working with families, carers and people with learning disabilities to enable them to have the best end-of-life experience we can, from improved recognition of last year of life and risk of dying, through advanced care planning, care of the dying, and finally bereavement. We used a gap analysis survey to find out about experience and confidence in looking after people with a learning disability amongst the hospice and learning disability team members. Strikingly, of those who responded to the survey, 42% had never looked after someone with a learning disability at the end of their life. The gap analysis showed us variations in confidence in a number of different areas of end-of-life care relating to people with learning disabilities and a need for targeted teaching. We have either delivered or planned sessions on the following subjects: learning disability awareness, breaking bad news, understanding distress behaviour in people with a learning disability, autism or cognitive impairment, pain and symptom management, decision making and capacity, and respect and advanced care planning. These online education sessions will have also been offered to all the Sussex hospices and NHS learning disability teams in Sussex in order to maximise the benefits of the project post. I joint work with the multi-professional teams, GPs and acute liaison, and we're broadening into community groups looking at creative ways of enabling discussion about what's important to me with people with learning disabilities. I have worked directly with families under the care of the hospice to support and encourage discussion and explanation about changing health and death and dying with their relative, providing guidance about breaking bad news in a way that is meaningful to the person with a learning disability. Although we are only halfway through, this project has been enlightening in many ways. There is a significant overlap in the holistic nature of both learning disability support and end-of-life care, and both sets of teams and our surrounding community have been extremely welcoming of this new role. The skill set of a learning disability nurse in a hospice both complements and enhances the skills already available. We have realised that there is a wider group of patients and their families who may benefit from the experience an LD nurse has. Where there are challenges to communication or capacity to consent, for example, where someone may be distressed and finding it hard to understand or express pain, or may refuse care or treatment. This is personally quite an emotional journey, as I realise that the LD nursing qualification is not a limitation to working in end-of-life care, but that instead I can be a valuable part of a fantastic, holistic, multidisciplinary team. We're all really excited to see what happens in the next 6 months and look towards the future of a specialist learning disability end-of-life care role that continues to improve outcomes for people with a learning disability in our area.
Great posters. Thank you all for all your effort. That's a big job to make a poster like that. Now we will listen to our afternoon plenary speaker.
I'm really pleased to introduce Jo Elverson. She is a consultant in adult palliative medicine at St Aldo's Hospice.
And she's a member of the Northern Region Children's Holistic Integrated Palliative Care Service. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
Yes.
CHIPS. And she trained in the Northeast and Oxford.
Jo is also a member of our PCPLD Network Specialist Advisory Group, just like me. Jo's talk is called Hello, Goodbye. Not to be confused with the Beatles song, of course.
The Beatles song, yeah, it's not a Beatles song.
Getting the best out of transition to adult health services. She's passionate about this. Over to you, Jo.
Hi, my name is Jo Elverson. I'm delighted to be here to speak to you today at the PCPLD conference. I'm going to talk about transition from children to adult services. This is a subject that's particularly close to my heart, as although I trained in adult palliative care, I currently work half of my time with adults and half of my time with children and young people. And so I hear many stories of how transition has gone for families and for individuals. It's a huge subject. I'm sharing some of the things that I'm learning at the moment, and I hope this will be helpful to everyone. I hope it will also give you a chance to reflect on some of your own stories and your own experiences around transition. So today I want to cover a few things. Firstly, what does transition mean? What am I actually talking about? Secondly, why is it important? Thinking a bit about the research that we have on transition. What do we know is best practice and how can we improve that? And then thinking about some particular areas that I think are relevant to this conference, where we're thinking about palliative care for people with learning disabilities, thinking about transition when health is uncertain, and transition when the right voices aren't being heard. So firstly, definitions. Well, in the dictionary, the word transition means a change from one place or state of being to another. And I think that's quite helpful because it's not an instant change. We're not talking about transformation or transfer. We're talking about transitioning. And if you think about moving from one place to another, depending where it is you want to go, you need to think about how to get there. You need to think about what you need to take on the journey, how you'll know where to go, and what you're going to do when you get there. And so in a way, that sort of a transition takes time, and it takes planning, and it takes a bit of process rather than being an instant thing. And so when we think about healthcare transition, this is my favourite definition. I think it covers really what healthcare transition should be. It talks about a lifespan approach wherein children are supported throughout their development to achieve their highest potential while learning to manage their condition, enabling them to more easily achieve their goals for adulthood. And so the key things from that are, one, transition takes time. It needs to start early, and it needs to extend beyond the point where the young person moves to adult services. We need to think of transition as being a long process where there are stages along the way. It needs to be personalised, both the goals of the individual, what they're able to achieve, but also the support they need to achieve it is individual, and everybody will be different. And we need to build services and teams who are able to be flexible enough to personalise that approach. And I think perhaps most importantly, healthcare is only one part of the bigger picture. Someone transitioning to adult healthcare is probably going through huge transitions with social care, with education, possibly thinking about housing, possibly thinking about care provision, maybe thinking about careers and employment. There may be changes within their family, there may be changes within their friendship. The healthcare changes are only one thing, but if healthcare is a source of stress, if it's a source of feeling unwell, feeling uncertain, worrying about what's going to happen and who's going to care for me, it has a massive impact on all of those other things. So as a healthcare provider, I need to get this right. I need to focus on my bit so that it can support all of the other parts of transition. And I guess following on from that is the reason that it's important. I've probably softened it slightly to say some people have difficult experiences when they transition to adult services. I have heard many stories of people having difficult experiences, and particularly people with very complex medical conditions, people where their diagnosis doesn't fit into an adult healthcare picture because traditionally they may not have survived to adulthood. People who don't know who to go to, don't know where to get support, and find that everything has changed. And people use quite graphic descriptions to think about transition. We often hear people feeling like they're moving towards the edge of a cliff and they know at some point they're going to fall off. Or one of the national documents in the UK talking about best practice for transition talks about this idea of moving from a pond into the sea, with the idea that the pond is small, it's secure, you know where you are, you know everything around you, and the sea is big and strange and scary. Now we know that any change can cause anxiety. Anything new leaves a bit of uncertainty, a bit of worry. But I think these are very graphic descriptions of how bad it feels for people who are experiencing transition. I'm an optimist, and I truly believe that transition can work well, but what it needs to work well is preparation and planning, clear information, that the adult teams need to be trusted and need to be worthy of that trust. They need to be consistent, they need to deliver when they promise something. And services need to be developed to meet people's needs, rather than expecting people to fit into the services that already exist. We need to actually be finding out what are the needs that are not being met and how can we do that. It is a big ask and we've got a long way to go with that. So going on to research, there's been some fantastic research around what happens in adolescence, what happens in that period between about 14 and 25, because it is a time of massive change in the brain, in the body, and in social and behavioural functioning. Now, most of the research, as far as I can tell, is done in people who do not have complex or long-term illnesses, and also in people who do not have learning disability. But I think it is still really important and relevant for today to think about what we know about the research. So firstly, as I say, the brain maturation continues well into your 20s. It terrifies me to think some of the decisions I was making in my early 20s, when actually knowing now that actually the last areas to fully mature in my brain are the ones around planning, emotional regulation, decision making, multitasking and self-awareness, as well as impulse control and reflection. These are quite big things that are still developing, still processing. And so the decisions that somebody might make in their early teens might be very different from the decisions they might make in their 20s. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind. The other thing that's really important to understand is the social interactions in teens and 20s are really key. The decision you make when you're surrounded by your peers may be very different from the decision you make when you're with your family members or when you're on your own. And the influence of friends, the influence of the people who are socially important to you is huge in this age group. The other really interesting thing we have discovered is that it seems that this final maturation of the brain takes place because of the new challenges, the challenging decision making, the life experiences that come with becoming an adult. So it's a chicken and egg thing, that you actually have to be exposed to these difficult decisions, to having to plan, to having to work out how to look after yourself. And actually that process itself helps you to develop the ability to do that. And so there's risk in that, and maybe it's important that we do know that at this age group, risk taking is huge, and actually then beds down and people take fewer risks as they get older. Maybe that's needed, because actually at this stage in development, that's what people need to be able to step out and try new things. But I think that's really interesting when we're thinking about young people who have long-term conditions, who maybe have stayed at home and aren't planning on moving out, or people with learning disabilities. We don't know how this applies to people where those new challenges, those new life experiences don't happen in the same way. And I think it's a question that we need to find out about. We need to understand about how the brain develops and matures in everybody, not just in healthy 20-somethings. So the other really important bit of research is looking specifically at transition. And the question is, what can improve transition? A group in Newcastle and Northumbria University a few years ago completed a 5-year programme of research into transition. They looked very widely at the experience of young people and their families, at the evidence, at everything that we know already about transition. And they came out to say that the best evidence is for 3 things that will improve transition. And I will talk about each of these things in turn. But the key things they say are developmentally appropriate care, appropriate parental involvement, and meeting clinicians before transfer. Now, I want to talk about each of these in more detail, but specifically I want to talk about them in the context that we're talking about, in people with maybe complex health conditions and learning disabilities. So firstly, developmentally appropriate care. Now, the definition of this is that it recognises the changing needs of young people and the need to embed health education and health promotion in consultations. So essentially, it's going back to that understanding about the development of the brain and recognising that everybody is at a different stage at a different point. And as I say, this process is over a decade or more, that what a young person needs when they're 15 or 16 is very different from what they may need when they're 21 or 23. It's important, therefore, with communication and decision making and health education, that we tailor it to individual needs and recognise that those needs may change. And I think although this is advice for everyone involved in transition, I think that's particularly relevant when we think about people with learning disability, that we need to make sure that anyone involved in healthcare for people with learning disability is able to tailor to individual needs, but also be open to the fact that those needs may change over time. But the second key thing about developmentally appropriate healthcare is providing a safe place to talk about health promotion. Now, as a palliative care physician, I don't often talk about very much health promotion. I wouldn't see that as a key thing that I do. But when you start to dig into this, you see that there actually are many aspects of promoting good health and well-being. Thinking about friendships, safety, thinking about relationships and sex. It's really important to give people an opportunity to ask questions from someone who is going to give them sensible and thoughtful answers. Drugs and alcohol, self-harm, but also things about how are things at home, what's happening with care provision, education, employment, what are your goals? And thinking more about palliative care, thinking maybe about the opportunities for talking about advanced care planning, or even about legacy, about what things you want to achieve, how you want to be remembered. I think some people feel overwhelmed by all of those things, and I think it's important to balance and not to bombard somebody with questions about all of these things. But the important thing about starting to ask those questions, starting to introduce some of these subjects, is it gives that very clear message of even if you don't want to talk about that right now, actually I'm happy to talk about that at the time that you do want to. And I think that's a really important message for teenagers and for young adults, to know that they have someone who is open to those conversations, that this is a safe place that they can bring any concerns they have around any of these issues. Even if I don't know the answer myself, I'm happy to listen, and I'm happy to help them to work towards an answer or to find somebody who can help. So the next aspect was appropriate parental involvement. And I think this is absolutely essential for so many of the young people that I work with. Appropriate parental involvement is not about shutting the door on the parents the moment the young person turns 18 and saying, oh no, it's the young person now, you can't stay in the room. It's also not about talking over the young person to the parent and never involving the young person at all, because we forget that they've actually grown up. It's about recognising individually where the parent's role is and what the young person needs, and recognising, particularly in young people with complex conditions, the parent is a source of practical and emotional support. They often act as an advocate for their young person. They have this ongoing role, even in a person who is fully able to make decisions for themselves. They often need somebody sensible to process information, who's also maybe listening to the same information so they can then bounce it off each other and check they've understood it, working towards a decision. And also, I've seen so many times, it's fantastic examples of parents really supporting their young adult in developing their voice and learning to speak up, to say what they want. And these parents have a fantastic role in this. Now, I have to apologise on behalf of many adult physicians who struggle to get that balance right and struggle to feel comfortable working with parents in an appropriate way, because I think we get tied up in knots over the need for the young person to feel independent, to have their own autonomy, and for confidentiality, and we get so stuck on that that we forget all of those top things about why the parent's role is important. The other thing I think is absolutely key, particularly when young people have very complex conditions and maybe need a lot of physical care from their parent or emotional care, is actually checking in with the parent themselves. How are you doing? Are you okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? Any questions you have? And if possible, giving them the opportunity to do that outside of the room with the young person. This isn't breaching confidentiality, it's about the support for that individual, recognising that if the parent is doing okay, they're better able to support that young person. They're a key part of that care. So Before I move on to the next point, I just want to tell you a brief story. I'm going to call this patient Sasha, but Sasha's story is really a mix of a number of different stories of young people that I've worked with, and I think it might resonate with some people. So Sasha is 17. She has profound learning disabilities and can only communicate what she likes or doesn't like using facial expressions and body language. She enjoys her school and lives with her family at home, and music is one of her particular loves. Sasha also has a lot of complex health needs. She's on medication for seizures and spasms, and she uses a wheelchair, but often has pain and discomfort, so she's spending more and more time in her bed. Over the last couple of years, she keeps getting chest infections that take a long time to resolve, and she spent a lot of time in hospital. Each time Sasha gets a chest infection, she becomes extremely unwell, and the doctors prepare her parents that she might not respond to treatment and that this time she might die. In spite of doing their very best to make her better, they're really worried that she might not survive the next year. Everyone is aware that Sasha's nearly 18, but talking about transition is the last thing on their mind. Her parents are thinking, how will anyone get to know her when she's so complex and everything is changing so quickly? We trust the teams caring for her right now. Changing now when things are so uncertain would feel very scary. And the doctors feel, we want to support Sasha and her family. If she's going to die, we want to see this through. We want to be caring for her to the end. Changing teams at the moment might not help her or her family. But Sasha keeps on recovering from each episode, and although she remains very vulnerable, she reaches her 18th birthday, and then she actually reaches her 19th as well. And although the people supporting Sasha all had the best reasons for not discussing transition, I think possibly a different outcome could have happened if they had. And so thinking about the third aspect of what makes transition work is about meeting the adult healthcare practitioner soon and before transfer. When health is uncertain, we struggle. I think many families may have been told that their child wouldn't reach adulthood and hadn't even expected to need to make plans for transition. I think on top of that, I've certainly come across many families who talk to other families and they all worry together about transition and become quite anxious about it. And in many situations like Sasha's, episodes of illness can be incredibly severe and sudden and unpredictable, and it's very difficult to know what's going to happen next. How are things going to be? What's the right decision to be making? It might be tempting to delay planning transition if a young person's health is unstable, but I think this can lead to more problems. I think if we avoid discussing transition, it leads to greater uncertainty and greater fear about this great big deal that nobody's talking about. For many young people with complex conditions, it can take time to identify the right team to lead on healthcare and adult services. In paediatrics, we have community paediatricians, we have neurodisability neurologists, we have specialists in complex conditions. And in adults services, we don't yet have those specialties. I know there are discussions around about how we can support young people, and I think this will change in the next 10 or 15 years, but at the moment each region or each area seems to have different solutions, and there isn't a single obvious neurodisability complex care specialty, and so it's difficult to find out who's the right person to take this forward. The GP is an obvious person to have an overview, to hold that real general umbrella of what's needed here, who do we need to look out for, how can we support this young person. But often GPs haven't been very involved during the time that the young person was a child, and they may feel very uncertain or need extra support in dealing with some of these very medically complex situations. So I think the key questions as paediatric healthcare professionals, we need to ask which specialist teams need to know about this person and need to meet them, and how involved is the GP already, what support do they need, and how can we get them on board, how can we bring them up to speed in this situation. And the best way to build trust is to physically meet the young person and their family early, so that they have a name and a face that they know. And I've seen great examples where that works really well. The other thing I would say is that some adult teams actually have additional sources of support. Working in palliative care recently, I worked with a young person who was being looked after by children's teams, but actually when he was reaching end of life care at home, the adult palliative care community team were able to support the children's nurses with medication he needed and with some of the practical things he needed. And so again, working together, they were able to give him better care. So my final area to think about is making sure voices are heard. The Mental Capacity Act is, again, a thing that comes up often when I have conversations with families around transition. Now, the Mental Capacity Act and equivalent laws in other countries essentially are created to protect the adult's right to make their own decisions. It's there for a good reason, but when people have very severe learning disability, it can feel arbitrary, it can feel obstructive or even harmful to the young person and their families. And I think it's very difficult to get that balance right. My key take homes for this are that all clinicians should be able to understand the law and to be prepared to explain it clearly. And that applies particularly, I think, to children's doctors, where they need to prepare people in advance. Families need information and advice well before their young person is 16 years old. They need to understand what's going to change, what it means to them and their young person, and whether they have any choices in that, what choices they might want to take in terms of legal ways to make sure that decisions are appropriately made. And enshrined in the Mental Capacity Act is the fact that every effort must be made to support the young person to make their own decisions. I'll come to that in a moment. And that best interest decisions must take into account the voices of the people that know that young person well. Now, for those last two things to happen, I think it's really important, wherever possible, to keep written records of who and what is needed. So I know this morning you had talks about advanced care planning and do not resuscitate orders, but I would say even more important than that is having something like a health passport, an emergency health plan, whatever you call it, something where you have a written document of what this person is like when they're well, about what adjustments and communication support they need, about any medical interventions you could anticipate them needing. So say someone who has chest infections, which antibiotics work? Have they ever needed respiratory, ventilatory support? What else have they needed that has helped, or what may they need that they very clearly do not want? And who to involve in decision making. And that's really important to have all of those things written down somewhere with the young person, so that when they access healthcare, they're there and easy to read. It's also really important to have some sort of list of priorities and preferences. And again, I'm probably not the best qualified, because I know that other people within this conference have done so much work around supporting people to talk about their preferences, to talk about what's important to them, whether they have capacity for those really complex decisions or not. We want to know what's important, what's their priorities. And we need to work with people to help them to develop their own voice. Where there is any scope for them to take part in that decision, we need to do what we can to help them when they're well, to start to talk, to start to make decisions, to start to express those preferences. But in the middle of a crisis, it can be really hard, but it's very important to create a space for listening. I think every story I've heard about where things have gone badly in a crisis are because people felt that they were trying to tell someone this isn't the way it should be, and that they didn't feel that anyone was there to listen to them. We need to try to find those spaces, those moments for listening, for saying, this is what we think is going on. What am I missing? Is there more that I need to know? Who else needs support in this situation? I think that's really important, whatever the clinical decisions are, to just get into the habit of trying to create that space and that time. So my final slide is thinking about what we need to do moving forward. Transition for palliative care teams, when we're thinking about these young people with complex conditions, very vulnerable health, and with learning disabilities. I think the first thing is to acknowledge young people as a distinct group within whatever we're doing, recognising that there is different needs for this age group and offer developmentally appropriate resources. And there are some fantastic ones that have been created for talking with young people, for addressing some of those complex issues that are really relevant to young people. We need to involve young people in training, in service planning and in evaluation, and that's young people of all abilities. It's just good practice. We need to have this individualised, flexible approach. We need to respond to the needs of the individual and their family who are in front of us. And although I've said that's about young people, actually, that should be what we're doing for everybody. We need to make sure that we have services that are flexible enough to respond to need. There is an awful lot of working with other people. A huge amount of my job is recognising I don't know the answer to that. I might not be the right person to support that, but developing a network of people that I can go to, people that I can ask, people that I can refer on to say, I know that you've got this fantastic programme going on with such and such. How can you help this young person? And going back to the research side of things, actually we need to include young people with complex conditions and young people with learning disabilities in research around transition and development. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jo. That was really wonderful. We will now have the second selection of our conference papers. We have 4 presentations coming up.
And first up is Louise George, who will tell us about the West of England Learning Disabilities Collaborative.
Thank you for having me here today to talk about the West of England Learning Disabilities Collaborative, an initiative hosted by the West of England Academic Health Science Network. It's a real pleasure to work with the network when the ethos of our 2 organisations are so well aligned, and I do hope this presentation inspires many of you to join us. The collaborative was established in 2019 in response to the leader finding that the disparity between the age of death for people with learning disabilities and the general population was 22 years for males and 27 years for females, with many of these deaths due to avoidable causes. An exploratory email was sent with the idea for a space to share best practice for people with an interest in supporting people with learning disabilities, and the responses flooded in. We now have over 300 members from across the NHS, providers, carers, and people with a learning disability, all committed to providing better care and support for people with learning disabilities. Feedback has celebrated the collaborative for creating a culture of collaboration, sharing of best practice, and rapid adoption and spread of initiatives to improve care across the West of England for people with a learning disability. We were recently thrilled to be named as finalists for Learning Disabilities Initiative of the Year in the HSJ Patient Safety Awards. We currently focus our effort on 3 key priorities: improving recognition of deterioration, including use of soft signs, improving the uptake and quality of annual health checks, and promoting the uptake of the flu vaccination, including highlighting the availability of the nasal spray as a reasonable adjustment. In 2020, we saw an average increase of 13% for annual health checks and 19% for flu vaccinations within our region, which we feel is a huge success given the pressure systems have been under throughout the pandemic. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in March 2020, the collaborative was put on hold to redirect resources to support our members through projects such as the COVID Oximetry at Home initiative. We felt that we should and could continue to support our members remotely, as it became clear early on that people with a learning disability were being disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The collaborative benefits from leadership from NHS England, and at the first webinar we provided both a national and local updates on how the COVID pandemic was affecting people with a learning disability. After almost 100 people attended the first webinar, we made these a bi-monthly event and went on to cover physical health during COVID, annual health checks, capacity assessments, oral health, and advanced care planning. 562 people have attended our webinars in the past 18 months. Between webinars, we were determined to keep our members as connected as possible to facilitate sharing best practice in a new remote world. We created a bi-monthly newsletter to share events, resources, and requests for support from other services, creating a culture of truly joined up working. We worked with people with lived experience to improve online meetings and make them accessible, empowering more people to get involved in shaping services. In the 2020 annual report, the LEADER programme recommended that carers and families be empowered to raise concerns in response to the impact of COVID-19 on people with a learning disability. Based on our previous work training care homes to use Restore2 Mini, a tool that uses observation of soft signs to support carers to recognise deterioration, we were commissioned by NHS England to train 120 super trainers to deliver training remotely to paid and unpaid carers across the UK. In February 2021, we delivered the super trainer model to 167 experienced trainers, who by the end of May had trained over 7,000 paid and unpaid carers, with training continuing to be delivered across the country. The training and resources were co-created with people with a learning disability, carers, and supporting organisations, and this has created the potential for the training to be delivered by people with lived experience in the future. To accompany the training, we worked with our members to develop a series of short, bite-sized videos in plain English, including measuring heart rate, oxygen levels, temperature, how to recognise soft signs, and how to tell someone if you are worried. The videos have over 13,000 views and have been shortlisted as part of a wider series on deterioration for a HSJ Patient Safety Award. I'm going to wrap this up by linking back to the reason we are all here today: improving care for people with a learning disability at the end of their life. Our focus is very much on advanced care planning in this field, and as well as supporting families and carers to recognise deterioration, which for some patients may indicate that they are nearing the end of life, the West of England AHSN has supported the implementation of Respect across the West of England. The Respect process creates personalised recommendations for a person's clinical care and treatment in a future emergency centred around what happens to them, what matters to them most. The collaborative works with providers to make the Respect process accessible to people with a learning disability, including sharing easy read resources, promoting Respect as an alternative to DNA CPR, and facilitating discussions around reasonable adjustments. During COVID-19, we responded to reports around resuscitation orders for people with a learning disability and hosted a webinar to gather experts on the topic. We were thrilled that Irene could join us to talk about better advanced care planning for people with a learning disability. Thank you again for this opportunity to highlight the work of the collaborative, particularly around advanced care planning. We welcome new members both locally and nationally, and I have included our details here for anyone interested in finding out more. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That was interesting.
Next is James Norris, who will tell us about digitalising and improving postural assessment in Wales.
Hello everyone, my name is James Norris and I'm the founder of My Wishes. Thanks a lot for accepting my abstract to present today. I hope that it's of interest and of value to you all. And should you have any questions, by all means, feel free to fire over some emails to me at support@mywishes.co.uk. Digitising and improving postural assessments in Wales. So just to recap, I'm the founder of the end-of-life platform My Wishes. Back in 2015, I set up the Digital Legacy Association. The Digital Legacy Association's mission is to raise awareness around the importance of planning for death digitally and the digital assets that we are increasingly creating and purchasing. So it can be digital assets perhaps of a sentimental value, so family photos, videos, etc. that are saved on our social media sites, behind password protected mobile phones, etc. And then digital assets of a monetary value as well. So things such as shopping points and cryptocurrency and purchased media, etc. So we raise awareness around the importance of planning for these different areas. We've created a conversation framework for healthcare professionals, free to access leaflets. There's a forwarded public section that helps the general public understand which platforms they use and are able to then make plans for their own digital footprint, which will one day become their digital legacy. As part of our work, we have a conference every year called the Digital Legacy Conference. This year, for the second year, it's going to take part of the European Association of Palliative Care World Congress. I'm a Digital Research Fellow at Michael Sobel Hospice in London, and I am an Honorary Design Fellow at the Velindre Cancer Centre in Wales. So a lot of my work over the years has revolved around creating a noise about our digital assets and our digital legacy and our digital footprint, and why it's important to plan for these different areas. Now, it works quite symbiotically with advanced care planning. When you talk to somebody, perhaps when doing a ward round about their digital legacy or the photos that they've got saved on their phone. But ultimately, our lives are increasingly migrating from this physical world to the digital realm. And what we're going to explore today, the postural care assessment and the postural care passport, what we're doing is we're making a form that is accessible in the physical world, rapidly available in the digital world as well. A hackathon is an event that takes place and you have a very limited amount of time to hack something together, to build something that's of value to a specific ecosystem. A health hack, therefore, is a hackathon that is based around health and social care. And when we came across the challenge that was presented by Sam, a physiotherapist who mostly works with children and young people, she found that the postural care assessments that she was creating were quite often left on the person's wheelchair. So in a case of an emergency, when postural assessment is required, this postural care assessment that is often attached to the person's wheelchair was not available. She would and still does create postural care assessments onto A5 pieces of laminated card. It does rely on that content always being with the person, and it's very common for these files to be missing when they're required. This is our amazing postural care passport team. We've got Marcus, our lead designer, Bethany, who is a PhD student who joined us for the project, Lucy Watts, MBE, who is our head of lived experience. As we mentioned before, Sam, who's the physio in Wales, who really spearheaded this whole project, myself and one of our wonderful developers, Fuad. We had to create the solution and we had to demo it back to the health hack 1 week later. What we solved was this problem when a clinician or a teacher or anyone in a clinical or non-clinical setting needs to have access to the postural assessment, but they're unable to do so because it's not available. So the first point of call would always be, initially, the postural care assessment was added and attached to the wheelchair. However, quite often that's not available. So the solution that we've built, as well as my postural care assessment being added, let's say, to my wheelchair and perhaps being available, it is then also uploaded to My Wishes. And there's a specially built postural care assessment section within the advanced care planning section. So we've expanded upon the kind of traditional advanced care planning form and integrated this within our advanced care plan. We've made it accessible rapidly by using a memorable word. So the memorable word that I've added today is PCPLD, and anybody with that word who goes to my public My Wishes page, so in a similar way to how you have a public Twitter account or LinkedIn account, so you have a handle. My handle on Twitter is /James Norris, and my handle on My Wishes is /James Norris. So if in this case he went to mywishes.co.uk /James Norris and he entered the memorable word, he then has access. He unlocks documentation and he has access to all of my postural care assessment documentation. Now, this might include the standard PDF that have been used to date, but it might also now include rich media. It might include a video highlighting and explaining certain ways in which I would be positioned. Again, providing more context, providing more support and providing more guidance, and hopefully reducing risk and harm. So here you can see the My Wishes dashboard once I've logged into the platform. And there's a number of items, menu items on the left-hand side here. I'm not going to go through them in any detail today, but you can write your will for free. You can write your funeral wishes, you can publish and tweet and share which songs you want to have played at your funeral if you wish to do so. You can create your advanced care plan, which we're going to look at in a minute. You can leave goodbye messages, so Victorian memory box, reworked for today's digital society. You can create a digital will or a social media will and state what you want to happen to all of your online accounts. You can create a bucket list and you can create private notes around your wishes and things that you hope to do. So I'm going to click on the advanced care planning section. And here you can see my ACP. Now I can save my ACP and then download the documentation. And once it's downloaded, my document is available as a PDF. You see now it's downloaded. I open up the documentation and this can then be printed, it can be emailed, it can be shared with a loved one, and all of your cares in one place, and it can be updated at any point over the course of your life. Back to the postural care assessment. So if I scroll down to the postural care assessment here, you can see here's two files that I uploaded earlier, and I've entered the memorable word already, PCPLD. And what I'm now going to do is move over to the public My Wishes page. My public My Wishes page, which as I mentioned is /James Norris. And this could be accessed by a QR code or a number of different means. But ultimately, if somebody needed to receive my postural care passport or my postural care assessment, they would simply enter the memorable word. And here you can see I've entered PCPLD, I've submitted it, and then my documentation is available. This is available and accessible on both mobile devices, tablets, etc. And by making it available in such a way, it means It's available in both clinical and non-clinical settings. And just to give you a quick overview, so if I was to condense the screen, you will see that it goes into the mobile format with the navigation here, minimized, etc. Thanks a lot for your time and your attention. I hope that you found what we've built of interest and hopefully of value. Feel free to get in contact with us. As I say, everything on My Wishes is free to use. However, if you'd like to discuss the postural care assessment or anything else in greater detail, we'd love to speak with you. The best email address to reach us on, once again, is support@mywishes.co.uk. Enjoy the rest of today's conference, and I look forward to seeing many of you in person very, very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, James.
Next, we have Sarah Swindell. She will tell us about McIntyre's Dying to Talk project.
Hi everybody and welcome to my presentation. My name is Sarah Swindell and I work for McIntyre. I am their Health, Dementia and Wellbeing Manager. I'm with you today, thank you to PCPLD for having me, to talk you through our NCLF National Community Lottery Fund, our 18-month funded project, which is called Dying to Talk. So a little bit before I start about who I am and what I do. So I oversee health, dementia, wellbeing for the people that McIntyre support, and that it involves a whole load of things, and one of the things that's within my remit or responsibilities is writing, developing the end-of-life care strategy and developing training for our staff teams. And when this project, when we heard we'd got the funding, the project came to sit under me for my responsibilities. So hopefully what you get from today is a little insight into the work that we're doing. A bit about McIntyre. So McIntyre support around 1,200 adults, young people and children across England and Wales, and that could be registered care services, it might be supported living services, shared lives, great communities, lifelong learning centres. There's a whole load of services that McIntyre offer. So let's get cracking because I've got 10 minutes. So next slide is a bit about how we got to where we are. So we were really fortunate that we had been awarded monies for a different project, which was our Department of Health funded 3-year dementia project, and that went on to win several national awards, and we're really proud of it. And it was within that project where we were supporting people to get timely diagnosis of dementia and raising awareness of learning disabilities and dementia, where we consulted with staff around, obviously dementia is terminal, it has no cure, and we realised we weren't doing enough around end-of-life care training and support for all staff, because we're supporting an ageing population, so that's really important. And that often staff or their circles of support can be quite fearful in talking about death and dying with people with learning disabilities, and we really wanted to break that stigma and to facilitate meaningful conversations with integrity. So we put together the Dying to Talk project bid. So as an overview, what it is designed to do is to test those solutions, to break down those barriers that people may face, and to promote better understanding and individual choice. So we are working alongside people with a learning disability and their support workers, family members, as well as the wider sector, to deliver our workshops, to provide information, create resources, and everything we do create will be made available on our website, mcintyrecharity.org. We've already got information up there free, able for anyone to download and access. So cracking on then with why it was needed. We've already said we've got an ageing population, people are getting older, and we weren't preparing people, but also there was that staff didn't feel that comfortable in talking about this topic, either with the people that we support themselves or family members. So we recognised that training and support from us was needed. So having a look at that in terms of a bit of context, you know, we did some pre-evaluation surveys. You can see there, the first one, that people definitely recognise that it was really important. You can see there all the strongly agree, you know, making up 91%. So people really saw the importance of this. But then if you look at the second bar chart just below, it says that people found it hard. And so we wanted for people to feel less afraid. And so this is what we're doing about it. Here are our aims. So within the 18-month pilot, we plan to help people with a learning disability themselves feel less frightened, to hear about death and dying, and to understand more, because we wanted to separate the confidence and the knowledge, because someone may gain more knowledge but may still not feel that confident. So we really wanted to unpick both of those and measure ourselves against either. We also wanted to help family members, help McIntyre staff, and help the wider sector external professionals. And our final objective was around creating a legacy of resources and best practice approaches that can be replicated not only across McIntyre from what we learned within the pilot, but also the wider learning disability and other healthcare communities, so that we share what we do. So we have external consultants that are working alongside us within the project. So we've got Irena, we've got Beth Britton, and we've also got a local Willing hospice that are based in Milton Keynes that are supporting us, and they all have defined roles within the project, and how they will help us map out and think through what we're doing. Just checking myself for time. Right, so next thing about how we think it will help. We believe that the project will have a big impact, not only for the people that we support, but also to our staff and circles of support, families, wider community, and that, you know, that lack of future planning or talking about death and dying can result in people feeling fearful or difficulty processing that, you know, the loss, but also can, you know, not having, you know, information may lead to lack of choice about their own decisions. So those are the barriers we really hope to break down, and we've already begun the work. So what have we done so far? The 18-month pilot is based in 4 areas across McIntyre. So we are in Chesterfield, Leicestershire, Worcestershire and Herefordshire, and we've got a core team that involves me, that's overseeing the day-to-day management. We've got a project manager, a project administrator. Project assistants is our 2 people with learning disabilities that are employed as part of the project, and then to help us, you know, obviously co-produce and work alongside people with learning disabilities is core to what we do. And then we've also got our project consultants who we spoke about earlier. So that's the core team, the project team that are involved in making this difference. We have begun staff training. So we have put together 3 half-a-day sessions, and you can see the topics there: an introduction to end-of-life care, exploring it, thinking about words and language and why that's so important, and then how to actually start the conversations and talk about death and dying is session 1. You can see session 2 there about advanced care planning, providing the best support, working with families, and then sessions 3 is around that last care in the last days and hours of life, what to expect, to break that fear of, am I going to be the person on shift, what am I supposed to do, but then also thinking continued care and support for everyone after death. And we ending session 3 by doing shared stories and remembering those that have been lost, which is a really great way to end the sessions. And feedback so far, because we've already begun delivering these trainings, is really good. So you can see some of the comments there. This session was really informative. I feel like I've learned a lot. I was not really looking forward to the session, but it went really well, so thank you. We are having to evidence everything that we do because it's an externally funded project, so we are collecting a lot of data and evidence about the project and what we're achieving. So how we are measuring it, so our evaluation approach. So that for this we are using action research methodology. So we are using and we are going to be reflective and evaluate each stage of the project, keeping formal success and learning logs, noting down all feedback that we get given. So if today you leave any feedback for us, that's all going to go towards the project, and we're regularly monitoring our progress, continuing to do what we always do, which is working alongside people with a learning disability to evaluate the progress as well. So lots there on evaluation, but because of time, I'm just going to skip on just to show you an example of the before survey sent out. So we sent surveys out to our staff as well as the people we support, and you can see examples there. So what we were trying to measure is around, you know, the confidence of talking about death and dying and the knowledge, and that was for our staff as well as the people we support, so we can do a before and after approach. So nearly there. In terms of sustainability, local infrastructure, our plan is to train up within the project each area to have its own end of life best practice mentor, who will be providing local support and infrastructure to local services to the people we support once the funding's ended, because we're really self-conscious that our ageing population isn't, after the project, not going to be there anymore. We're going to continue to have an ageing population now, and it was important to us that post-project, post-funding, that the work didn't just stop, so that we had the legacy of resources, which I spoke about earlier, as well as our end-of-life care mentors, which we're really happy for. So in a nutshell, last slide, this project is about living and living well, making choices, being informed, and living an equal life, and to support people to live a life without fear, reach out when wanting to ask for help, and to access those services that they need to, and to plan advanced care planning, and keeping the people absolutely in the centre and involved in, you know, helping us think this all through. So we're 6 months in, and hopefully if you follow us on at HealthLD or our Meet McIntyre accounts, you'll continue to stay in the loop with the progress of the project, and hopefully speak to you soon. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much. Bye.
That all sounds very interesting, Sarah. Thank you. Last, but by no means least, is Sue Marston.
And Sue's presentation is called How Do Carers Prepare and Support People with Learning Disabilities when Facing Bereavement? And of course, we've already seen Sue with her wonderful poster presentation earlier. So this is Act 2 for her. Over to you, Sue.
Paid carers' understanding and experiences of meaningful involvement in bereavement for people with intellectual disability when a significant other is dying. Julie Hideyoglu, Sue Marsden, Amy Sackery and David Oliver. Presented today by Sue Marsden. This pilot research project was completed by a small multidisciplinary team who are all members of the local Palliative Care Research Forum. And we wanted to research how paid carers understood and implemented meaningful engagement with people with intellectual disabilities whom they supported when a significant other was dying. This is an area that has received increased attention in recent years, and as adults with an intellectual disability live longer lives, they are more likely to experience the death of a person important to them, including the loss of family, friends, co-residents and carers or support workers. We already know that people with an intellectual disability have a very similar experience of grief to the general population, but that their expression of grief may be atypical and not recognised as such by those supporting them. We were interested in how paid carers recognised and understood the grief process in the people they supported, and whether there is still more that needs to be done to support these paid carers in their work. Grief is a normal part of bereavement, but people with a learning disability may find it hard to access mainstream counselling, or may not have been part of the natural sharing of information and experiences that help someone to understand the death of a loved one. This may risk someone with an intellectual disability experiencing a disordered or prolonged grieving process. Previous research has shown that people supporting someone with an intellectual disability may find it hard to break bad news, and in this particular case, to share or explain information about death and dying. It is natural for any carer to feel anxious about sharing this kind of news, especially when they may not be sure themselves about how much someone understands. Paid carers may try to avoid conversations about death and dying, or you may use euphemisms to explain death, further risking confusion or misunderstanding about what is happening. We used local knowledge of care teams who had recently experienced a bereavement and approached them to ask if their staff would be prepared to talk to us. Where our approach was accepted, we arranged for an interviewer to attend the residential home and record a semi-structured interview with individual carers. We asked a number of questions to gain the views and experiences of the carers and to enable them to share with us how they supported the people they cared for when faced with the imminent or actual death of a significant person. Thematic analysis was used to identify patterns, concepts and themes across the data by 2 members of the research team. Initially independently, and then with all the authors together revising and confirming the themes. These were the main themes. Paid carers were unsure about how much information residents could understand about death, and they were concerned about upsetting people, including concern about causing difficult behaviour as a response to bad news. Carers were also sometimes concerned about how much information could be shared from a confidentiality point of view. Meaningful involvement in the rites and rituals around death and dying was seen as a good thing, but staff were unsure how to individualise support to do this. Despite the deaths that were being experienced being expected and not sudden deaths, residents weren't usually involved in conversations about death and dying until after their fellow resident had died. It was recognised, however, that despite lack of conversations about what was happening, the residents in the house understood something was happening. It was evident that the carers themselves developed close bonds with the people they supported and experienced their own grief when someone died. Carers reported good informal support, but little of a more formal kind, and it is recognised that there is no requirement or expectation on paid carers to have training in end-of-life care or in how to support others during a bereavement. Support from the specialist local teams such as hospice or learning disability teams was reported positively, but was not extensive and did not reach every member of the care team interviewed. This was a time-limited pilot study, but it reached similar conclusions to other recent research. It highlights the need for meaningful involvement of people with intellectual disabilities when faced with an unexpected death, and shows that this is not still fully happening in practice. Most carers did recognise the impact of a death upon their residents, but were not always confident in assessing someone's understanding, the level of that impact, or how to have challenging conversations. As stated earlier, these carers received little or no formal training in end-of-life care, and they had vastly different skills and experience about communicating about death and dying. Funerals remain the most likely engagement individuals with an intellectual disability would have in relation to a death, with very few carers recognising the benefits of supporting shared understanding prior to a death, and all the engagement described by carers related to care and support after death. It came through clearly that paid carers felt a lack of support around when and how to have conversations about death, bereavement and the bereavement process, and also about how to manage their own grief. It was surprising to us that there was limited mention of the involvement of the specialist intellectual disability teams who had been involved in the care of these individuals. And this study highlights the importance of early, proactive and structured support from these services to enable them to engage with more care team members.
That concludes today's conference papers. It's been absolutely wonderful listening to all the speakers. I know a lot of work has gone into preparing all these talks and these posters. So thank you, we're really grateful, and it's been a very enlightening day so far. Keep writing your comments and your questions in the Q&A, because we have half an hour at the end of this day to look at that and to talk about them. But before we do that, I couldn't be more delighted to introduce our final speaker.
Yeah, and she is Dr. Catherine Mannix, a retired palliative care doctor. Her new book, Listen, is out today. We are really happy that she's able to join us to tell us about it.
On this very day that her book is out, isn't that amazing? So let's welcome Catherine. Catherine, come and join us.
Oh, hi. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to talking to us. I'm going to hand over to Irene.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. It's so lovely to see you again. You've become a bit of a regular at our events and our webinars. But you've come today because this is the very day, Catherine, that your new book is published. It's called "Listen: How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations."
It is.
We've not stayed in, but Peter, you and I were talking about, wondering why she'd called it that. What can you remember? What did we think tender conversations means?
Well, for me, I think tender means it's delicate. Because death and dying is such a sensitive subject. The word that we use when we speak to is very sensitive, so we use sensitive words.
Yeah. Sensitive words. And
I like that, Peter. I like the words delicate and sensitive that you've used there. And actually, I wonder even whether they might have been better words in the title. That they're really good words, because we do feel sensitive and a little bit anxious, don't we, when we talk about those things?
Yeah. We do, but there's more than one meaning, wasn't there, Peter? Because we also talked about
the meaning. It's used in different context. Like in the 40s when they sent something out to tender.
Yes, indeed.
I
love that. I actually there's a little chapter in the book that looks at different meanings of the word tender. I missed that one, but one of the things that I thought about was there's an expression to tender your attention, to give it to somebody, to just offer it to somebody. And I think maybe that's another, in this context, a useful interpretation, isn't it?
Yeah. So what you explained to us, and the other one we thought of was painful, isn't it? If you put a stone and then you say it feels a bit tender, because when you touch it, it's
so tender and warm.
Yeah, and I think when something is tender, it isn't hurting yet, but it might hurt. That's the thing, isn't it? So you have to approach it very gently. And just as the doctor might need to feel your tummy when it's sore, and I have to do it really gently because you are so tender, I think these conversations, one of us, both of us, might feel tender about talking about this. So we've got to be really gentle with each other.
Yeah. So Catherine, could you explain a bit exactly what, because you use that term a lot, and I like it, tender conversations. We're much more used to hearing things like difficult conversations, challenging conversations. So can you talk us through what your book is about and why it's called this?
I can, thank you. So let me wave the book at you, because I'm so excited because they arrived in the post and I hadn't seen the finished book yet. So this is really, really lovely. And we're going to read a little bit of it in a minute. But this all started really because I've been writing and talking in the media about how important it is that we can talk to each other about the ends of our lives, get ready, not have worries because we haven't dared to ask about things. So if we know more, what happens is actually we feel less afraid. But very often our doctors or the people who love us don't want to have that conversation because they're worried it will make them sad and they're worried it will make us sad. So it becomes a bit of a secret, doesn't it? And as you said, then people think, oh, it's going to be a difficult conversation. And I think that if we think something's going to be difficult,
we get ourselves all tensed up about it. Right, I'm going to try and talk about this, and we're so busy worrying about it being difficult that we're not really giving our best attention to just talking to each other. And this is usually somebody we know really well. It's somebody we're really fond of. Normally we would have really easy conversations with them. So I wondered whether if we didn't call them difficult, we would stop thinking about them being so difficult. And if we called them what they really are, which is tender, you and I need to talk about this thing, which might make us sad, but we trust each other and we know each other well enough that we can be sad together if we need to be. That's okay. Then maybe we'll come into the conversation, me being me and you being you, and us just being normal with each other. And wouldn't that make the whole thing a bit easier?
Yeah. Thank you. And I wonder whether this is a nice moment, a good moment for you to read a bit of that book, because you've given so much. I've been very lucky because you've sent me a preview and I've managed to be able to read it. There are so many amazing, but very personal and sad sometimes stories, but also very uplifting one, but very personal stories. And the one that you've chosen to read to us is one of those. So do you just want to share that with on this very day, the 16th of September, when your book comes out?
So thank you very much for asking me. The book is not just about end-of-life conversations, but it came out of my experience of end-of-life conversations. And this is one of my very, very early experiences. I was a very junior doctor and I was on call for the weekend for the local cancer centre where I was working at the time. And this event happened, and it was important because it changed the way I did things afterwards. I'd been called in to set up a drip for a lady who was a young mother who was having treatment for an imbalance of the biochemistry in her blood, and she needed to have a drip to try to put things right, but we weren't sure whether or not she was going to survive. So I'm in her room and I'm putting up her drip when this conversation happened. Am I dying, doctor? She repeats, her dry mouth making her lips click. I'm flummoxed. I have never been asked this question before. Really? Or have I just never heard it so clearly before? I don't know what to say. She is sick enough to die, but she may pull through. It's not my role to discuss this. She should talk to the team that she knows tomorrow. Of course not. I hear myself say, my voice is high and squeaky. I'm gathering my kit. I am rushing from the room. I am running away. By Monday morning, she is dead. She never got to say goodbye to her husband. She didn't have a last cuddle with her daughters. She was asking me for a truth I found too bitter to acknowledge. And I lied to her. I may never recover from this shame. Obviously, I tell no one. More than 30 years later, that shame and guilt is as fresh as ever. Her husband will be a pensioner now. Her daughters may have children of their own. They can never have back those hours I stole from them. I wonder how it has affected their lives. I know how it's affected mine. I have learned to say the D words. I have rolled them around in my mouth like massive marbles, too huge to articulate, too large to spit out, too painful to swallow. I have chewed them and tasted them and reduced them to a manageable size. Death, dying, dead. See? Because talking about death won't make it happen, but not talking about it robs us of choices and moments that will not come again. I have specialised in palliative care. And I have had honest end-of-life discussions many thousands of times. I have explained the process of dying, whose gentleness consoles people once they know what to expect. I have answered questions with calm clarity. I have seen death many times, and I am not afraid. My voice no longer squeaks. It's safe to talk about dying. It's vital that we do. And it's vital that we talk to each other in families and friendship groups, not only in medical settings, and we find the words with which to cross that threshold. I'm very, very proud to say that I managed to read that without crying this time, and that's the first. I had to read it for the audiobook about 2 weeks ago and had to stop several times. It's still very, very real for me, that experience of not knowing what to say, being young, being frightened. And I can understand who that girl was now, that young, frightened me. But for a long time, I just felt very ashamed that I'd let her down.
Catherine, it's so moving, and I recognise, though I was that young nurse, one question that we were going to ask is to write that down and to because there's lots of stories like that that are really very personal, and you read them, you relive them. What's that like for you personally, to go over that again and again?
It's interesting because it's both difficult. It is difficult, and you know, as I was writing it, and the first several times that I had to edit it or read it aloud for the book, it's like time travel. And our memory is like time travel, isn't it? You sometimes don't feel that you're remembering it. You feel as though you're there again and it's happening. But also, it's helpful, and it's almost as though, you know, grown up, wise me can go back to young and frightened me and say, it's okay, this was a mistake and you can't put it right, but look at what you've learned, look at how it's changed you, look at the families who have been helped because you did the work of recognizing you'd done that wrong, and were able to help other families so that you didn't make that mistake again. And it is awful that we make mistakes in life and we hurt people, and sometimes we can't put the hurt right. But we can't spend our whole lives only lamenting our mistakes, can we? We've got to be able to say, okay, that was bad. I'm not proud of that. But what could I do in future that is better than that? And I always feel that I'm somehow honouring that family when I step up now, even though I can't ever put it right for them, and they will never know what I owe them for that experience having changed me.
That is so true and moving, Catherine, and it really makes me think, you know, within our PCPLD network, for example, I know there are a lot of people who come to it because of something that really didn't go well, and they feel terrible about it. And wonderful things have come out of that. People really sort of learning and stepping up their learning, you know, and sharing those experiences and just listening. I'm just going to explain to Peter a bit, because I'm not sure how much of this you can hear, but Catherine is saying she had the bit she read. She had a patient when she was very young, a young doctor, okay, and the patient, it was a woman. Did you give her a name? I don't
think I did.
Okay. She had a family and she was dying in the hospice. In the hospital. She didn't have long to live. Just a few days maybe. And the doctor, Catherine, that was a young doctor, knew that from all her medical history. And the woman asked, "Am I dying, doctor?" And Catherine is thinking about how she said, "No, of course not. You'll be fine." And then she died a few days later and never had a chance to say goodbye to her family because they weren't called in. And Catherine is talking about how how terrible that made her feel because the family missed the chance to say goodbye. Right? I don't know. It's difficult, isn't it? Because
it was must have been heartrending at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, Peter. It
Yeah.
was. And I think that it made me realise that I had to learn how to have these conversations. I could never let another family down like I let that family down.
Yeah.
So I think making really bad mistakes changes us. And sometimes it makes us better people.
Yeah. But it's also you look back and you think, do you think that was a mistake, Peter? When she said, because a lot of people, when somebody would ask you, am I going to die, Peter?
Yeah.
And if you know that the answer is yes, because you know how ill they are, the doctors told you, somebody you love, am I going to die, Peter? How hard will it be to say, to be honest, to say yes?
It's hard. It's very hard. But at the same time, we've got to be truthful, haven't we?
At the same time, you do have to be truthful. Why do you think we have to be truthful?
Well, that's a truthful. But that's how it is. That's how life is, isn't it? That's how life is.
That is how life is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you think we have to be truthful, Catherine? What? If you look back and you say you can look at a frightened young doctor now, with the wisdom you've gained and learned from all these patients and families, what would be wisdom? What would you say to her? What would you advise that young doctor?
I would ask her to notice what's happening. That lady asked her twice. So sometimes people ask the question, but they don't really want to know. They really want you to say, no, you're not dying. But when she asked a second time, I think that young doctor should have realised that she wanted to know, and she had reasons to want to know, because she had children, she had a husband, and she may have had very important things to say to them. So I think when somebody asks us, the first thing, the best thing to do is to check back with them. Do they really want to talk about that? And if they do really want to talk about that, do they want to do it now while it's just you and me? Or is there somebody they would like to have with them while they have that conversation? Do they have a friend, a family member, a person who's their best supporter, who could be with them and support them while we have that conversation? So we don't have to answer there and then, but perhaps we have to agree that we will answer there and then decide when to have that conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. It's just there's so much we can talk and ask and unpick here. Yeah, I'm just conscious of the time. We could already talk all afternoon, didn't we?
Yeah.
But you had one other question that you really wanted to ask.
I've got a question anyway. Have we got another book? Have we got another book lined up? And when will it be out?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. So this is my second book, and my niece was talking to me about this yesterday, and so she was saying, so the first book says we need to talk about these things. Here are some stories that help us to be a little bit more in the know about what happens. And then the second book is, here are some ways that you can talk about these difficult things. And I think the third book might be about some of the difficult decisions that we need to make. Those decisions about treatments we want to have or treatments we don't want to have, where we want to live, who will be our supporters, those sorts of things. And I'm particularly interested in the part of that really, I'm going to have to come to the network, I think, for advice when I'm writing this next book, because I think that there are a lot of people who take over when they think a person doesn't have capacity to make decisions, and they stop asking people what they want
what they think, what their preferences are. So I want to write a little bit next time about decision making when people might not have complete capacity for a decision, but they will certainly have an opinion and very sensible views about what might happen, and how you make sure that those views get into the decision. So I don't know. At this point in time, I usually say, I'm never going to write another book again. But Peter, if I do write another book, I think it will be about the decisions and respecting people's wishes.
Okay, thank you. This book we just written, how long did it take you to write this book?
It took, so sitting down and doing some writing a bit every day for about 6 months. But I suppose I've been thinking it through in my head for 30 years. So that the end of it, I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I had to think about all the mistakes I've made. So I could only do it a little bit at a time, because it made me a little bit emotional to write it. But about 6 months altogether.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. And just to remind everybody, your first book was called With the End in Mind. And that is stories of people who are at the end of their lives, stories of people who are dying. This book, Listen, How to Find the Words for Tender Conversations. Do hold it up, Catherine. It's lovely to see that first hot off the press. It's still steaming. You can see it's still steaming. Published today by HarperCollins. So we'll make sure that everybody has the link to that, and all just queue up and buy your copy. It really is worth reading. And we wait with, in patience for book number 3. I think that's a really necessary one. But thank you very much for giving us the time.
Yeah, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be able to join you on this day when you're talking about something so important. And what I want is that people will listen to the wisdom from the network. So there we are. I've named a book for you. Listen.
All right.
Have a great conference.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, Catherine. Bye. Isn't it wonderful to talk to Catherine? Such a wonderful person. Yeah, really, and do get her book. It's so good. So we're now going to the Q&A. We've got half an hour left for that. Unfortunately, Peter, you can't stay for it.
No.
So at this point, I'm going to say a huge thank you to my co-chair, Peter Allen. I want to give you a round of applause, Peter. I can hear everybody out there clapping for you.
It's nice being here.
It's been wonderful and much better than sharing it on my own. So thank you very much. And before we go to the Q&A, can I just remind you, I'm reaching out to show you the Linda Meckenhill Award, which is the trophy that we give for our award that's been running since 2008. We give this to organisations, individuals who've made a positive difference to the end of life care and bereavement care of people with a learning disability. And we haven't had an award for a couple of years because of COVID, etc. But tonight we shall give this to, well, you will be able to see who's been nominated, who's been shortlisted, and we know, because you and I are both on the judging panel, so we know where this award is going, but you don't. So it'll be a wonderful, wonderful evening. Do come and bring your hankies. I'm warning you, bring your hankies. It's going to be really powerfully moving, presented by Nikki Fox from the BBC News. 7 o'clock, and it's free. So we'll put a link again in the chat box, in the Q&A box. So just turn up 7 o'clock tonight. But in the meantime, thanks, Peter, and let's just move on to the Q&A now. Oh, thank you, everybody. That's been a wonderful day of presentations and talks. We've got half an hour left before we finish today's conference, just for having a discussion. And I've got a panel here with some of today's speakers present. So we've got Mark Taubert, Catherine Mannix and Joe Elverson, who are our keynote speakers, are here now. And I've also got Sarah Swindells and Sue Marsden. So let's just start this discussion. It strikes me, listening to all of you, how much we are all talking about communication and being open and planning ahead, and how difficult that can be. I'm going to bring in Mark first, actually, Mark, because you opened the conference this morning and there were so many questions. You talked about DNA, CPR, and those kind of discussions. Can I ask you, Mark, you talked about how we need to sort of assess whether people are willing to talk about these kind of things, or whether you would cause long-term psychological harm when you talk to people about whether they want to have a DNA CPR order. Do you find that people with learning disabilities find that more difficult? Or because that's often the fear, isn't it? We can't talk to people with learning disabilities about this because they won't cope with it as well. Can you say something about those kind of discussions you have with people with learning disabilities about DNA CPR?
Yeah. I would say I'm a bit biased now, because just on Tuesday, I spoke to someone with learning disabilities and everyone said it was going to be difficult, and it was very easy. It was very straightforward, and she just wanted plain talking, basically. Just didn't want people flouncing around. And we palliative care professionals, we like to dress things up and flounce things around, but she just wanted straight talk, boom, 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 boom. Wanted to know what the situation was, wanted a frank conversation about it, was very happy to potentially disagree with me on certain points, asked a lot of good questions about it. I think her husband, who also had a learning disability, was a bit more surprised at her reactions, possibly, and perhaps I would have had a very different conversation to him. So I can't generalize it, I must say. Sometimes maybe we worry about it too much, and sometimes you just have to go in. I have these conversations a lot, and because I've had these conversations a lot and I'm in the front line a lot, I also get, I've had my fair share of complaints about it as well, when people have not wanted a frank conversation and I've maybe been a bit too direct. But I've not found that with people with learning disabilities particularly. I think it's more, I don't know. I think everyone has a different approach and attitude towards it. And I think if I think about my parents, they're very different in their own way about how they approach it. One doesn't want to talk about it at all, and that's just been the upbringing. Death and dying is just not something that's talked about. There's other issues, and the other person wants to talk about it all the time. So you can imagine the Sunday lunch conversations aren't always very easy.
And do you find, Mark, that, because that was one question that came up in the Q&A, do you find that it's necessary to, or do you use sort of easy read or accessible materials? I get this, we get this question a lot at the PCPLD network. Do we have any easy read or accessible ways of explaining DNAR and DNA CPR?
Yeah, so we worked with a learning disability team in IRIM Bevan Health Board, and they said, yes, absolutely, we're really happy to do you an easy read booklet for DNA CPR. Give us the materials you've got already. And so on the websites which are provided in my talk, the wales.nhs.uk/DNA CPR, if you go to the patient section there's a whole list of resources, and the easy read patient information leaflet is there. Could probably do with a bit of an update. People find it useful, but the graphics in it are just a bit they look a bit cheap. Maybe we can get a bit of an artist working on it or something like that. Just they don't look so good, I think. But actually, strangely enough, I often offer it and people don't necessarily really want it. Maybe people are just a bit swamped with written materials and patient information leaflets and things like that. People prefer to see, I think, a video or hear a podcast or things like that. And maybe our old patient information leaflets are not quite cutting it anymore. So it's been rare that someone has, I've sometimes said, here's a patient information leaflet, and they've just said, oh, I'm not interested. But they're more maybe interested in listening to a podcast or a video or something like that. So I'm a bit more interested in how we can get those directly to people. And we've created things like the videos that I showed you, but also QR codes that take you directly to the video, because people with learning disabilities in the hospital, they're quite savvy with their phones, and some of them are really, really good and quick on them and can scan a QR code and then look at it in their own time. and then ask me the questions the next day in terms of, oh, I watched that video, there was something I didn't understand, can you talk to me about that, basically. So I don't approach it differently as with anyone else, in a way.
Yeah, oh, well, thanks, Mark. And I'm just actually now going to bring in Joe here as well, because Joe, you talked about sort of thinking ahead with young people, children, about transition, and that almost seems like the beginning of planning ahead, you know, the sort of the different early stage of life. But it seems to me that there are many links with advanced care planning and talking about death and knowing, you know, what's ahead. I mean, even Catherine's story she read about somebody asking, am I going to die? You know, so can you say something about how early and how early can we start talking about these kinds of things? Because the people you work with are all very young, and the worry might be that it's too early. Can it ever be too early? And what is the link that you see there with advanced care planning? These are lots of questions all at once, but I wonder whether you can just touch on some of them.
No, they are all connected, and I think it's really good to be able to speak to that. So I would say advanced care planning needs to start as soon as we think that there is a possibility that this young person could become very unwell. And a lot, working with children and working with young adults, a lot of the time the advanced care planning is about advocating for active treatment as much as saying about the things they don't want. We have young people with vulnerable chests who maybe get chest infection quite regularly, and actually talking through with them, with the clinicians, with the intensive care people, what could they benefit from is really important, so that when they come into hospital in a crisis, nobody writes them off and assumes that they wouldn't benefit from something that actually has worked in the past, or that they actually would be a very appropriate treatment. So a lot of the very early advanced care planning with children with complex conditions might be much more about actually planning what do we want to write down that should be happening. But that then introduces a relationship, it starts that conversation, so that then you can very naturally say, there may come a time where that doesn't work so well, there may come a time where you don't want that level of treatment, or whether it seems distressing. We need to keep revisiting this so that you have the opportunity to look at this again. And particularly, I think somebody earlier said, based on the experiences people have had after an acute illness, it's a really good point to actually catch up with somebody and say, how was that? Is that how you would want it to be next time, or are there things you would want differently? And so I think it's all relationship. There's no one particular time that's right or wrong for anybody, because it's all about the individual, and a lot of it is bringing the family along as well. The other thing I would say, as a adult medic, I have had very, very little training in how to communicate with people with learning disabilities. So everything I've learned is either the generic communication skills that Kath and Mark and people, we all learn through doing palliative care, or it's particularly, I think, from my experience, it's actually watching and learning from learning disability nurses, and actually seeing how much more they can get from someone than I can in communicating. And I think we need to recognise that there's a huge gap in our knowledge and skills, and either we need to address that, which would be great, or we need to make sure we have someone along with us who has those skills or has that existing relationship with a young person, so that they can really bring out the best of them and make sure that we are doing everything we can to hear their voice.
Thanks, Joe. And we're very lucky on this panel, because here we got Sue Marsden, who is the very person, you know, she's a learning disability nurse, and she talked to us about how she's bringing in her skills of learning disability into the hospice. Sue, can you just say something about you know, how we can make that maybe sustainable? I mean, I know not all hospices have a learning disability expertise or a nurse, and your project, I think, is just there for a couple of years. Is that right? You have a lot of experience of working with people with learning disabilities at the end of life in the community as a learning disability nurse. How do you see what is a good way of sharing that with hospices and palliative care teams in the longer term?
Thanks, Irene. Gosh, that's a really, really difficult question, actually. I think it's the one that I've spent the last 7 months pondering in many ways, is where does that role lie? Does it sit within hospice and specialist palliative care, or should it be a skill that sits within the learning disability services? And how do you make sure that we share it equitably, I suppose, in some ways, because there is so much work around palliative care that needs to be done within learning disability services, those early conversations, those relationships. But then there's the more specialist side of symptom management and actual sort of end of life care, last days, that sits often under hospice care. So I suppose the quick answer is I don't know where it needs to sit, and I think we're still all finding out. The important thing I think that we've learnt in this last 7 months so far, and I'm on a countdown now, which is really hard because it's only a year's project. So I'm now almost halfway through and it gets a bit, oh, this is going to end soon. What do we do to create a legacy? And that's so important for me. It is those relationships, and it's giving permission, I think. So we start early. So let's start with our learning disability services, with understanding and really being clear about the fact that everybody dies. Everybody dies one day, and to understand and recognise the risk of dying. And if we can really work with our learning disability service to understand the risk of dying, then we will start those conversations much earlier. And if we started the conversations earlier, then we will get the hospice and palliative care services involved at a much better time. So I suppose that for me is, I think, where I am at the moment in that.
Oh, thanks, Sue. And I mean, it's interesting because in a way, this is why the PCPLD network started, is because we all think there is somebody else out there who's the expert, right? So we've heard, the palliative care, like Joe saying, it's quite hard for us to know how to communicate with people with learning disabilities. We can't do that. Other people can do it. We won't touch it. And then there's actually, Sarah, I'm going to bring you in here because you work in the learning disability service, and you talked to us about the project you started with your staff and the people with learning disabilities that you support in talking about dying, and how difficult they find that. Can you say something about how, whether there's sort of much resistance to it, whether people are happy to talk about it, and whether, again, how you think that can be sustained? I'm realizing now I'm asking everybody 3 or 4 questions at once because we've got so many, but start where you again, Sarah.
No, that's okay. We definitely, from speaking with staff, know that it is something that they really struggle to talk about. And we had a person from a hospice come in and speak to our teams. We run health special interest groups where we get people across the country together. This was pre-COVID. We now run them virtually. And the lady said, right, you've got 10 minutes, find someone in the room that you don't know. So I found someone in the room I didn't know, a staff member, and she said, right, you've got 10 minutes, talk about death, go. And the staff member said to me, when I was much younger, I lost my brother, and then quite soon after that, I lost both my parents. And she said, this is a top, even though that was now, many years ago, 30 years ago, I don't want to talk about this. And this is not something that I feel that confident in. So I think on top of thinking through what we need to achieve in a work environment, we also need to recognise, obviously, that people have personal lives, and all of us have a personal journey with bereavement, loss, death, where things have affected us, and it may not be something that we're that confident in. And I think it's about trying to break down those barriers, because as a society, we don't tend to talk about death and dying that regularly, and how to break down those barriers, trying out lots of different methods with the people we support in talking about it and what makes people feel comfortable. But again, every single person is different and every approach is different. And then that creates a myriad of approaches, lots of different approaches to try and get this right. And so that's quite complex, but shouldn't put us off it. and shouldn't mean that we then stop. Obviously, it is meeting people's needs. So is that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And let me just bring in Catherine here. Catherine Mannix. Catherine, I'm so glad you managed to come back to us, because I know that you're shooting off to do various radio interviews and all manner of things on this very day that your book is published. But can you, because you've having listened to all these discussions, you know, and I know that you spent a lot of time thinking about how to help the general public and all the different professions in different settings to think and talk about death and dying and to plan ahead for it and to be ready for it. How can we move this forward and make, you know, have these different fields meet? Learning disability, end of life care providers, you know, not to be too frightened of these discussions.
It's huge, isn't it? And I'm not sure whether the problem is ours as healthcare providers or whether it's ours as human beings. That actually we take our healthcare professionals from the pool of the general population. Most people have not had the blessing that I had growing up of having a cousin with a learning disability, so that I could be able to talk to her to see how her brothers and sister and parents talked to her to learn how to do that communication. So that relationship was a really positive thing in my life. Most people haven't had the benefit of seeing a person dying, following the process of ordinary dying, possibly at home, that maybe my grandmother would have had 100 years ago. So we come from a population that doesn't know about these things, and we specialise in our health sciences that doesn't teach us about these things. And I was intrigued that my daughter trained to be a children's nurse, but learning disability was a different branch of nursing, and there was no learning disability placement for a children's nursing training. Goodness me. So we need to have a root and branch think about how we get the message that we're all mortal, and that the people who are within our families and communities who are living with learning disabilities also are mortal and are not going to die differently from the rest of us, but will understand differently unless we're able to discuss with them to the extent that they want to know, which is the same as any other person. There are people without learning disabilities who want to know nothing, and others who want to know everything, and people with learning disabilities are at both ends and in the middle as well. So I think that getting the conversation going at a non-medical level is a really important part of that. And that's the pot that I'm trying to stir with my writing and broadcasting. But what's wonderful is that there's this receptive group of people in the professions and interested lay people who are helping with that, because none of us can do this on our own, can we? But look at the size of this network now. Look at the popularity of the webinars, look at the size of the conference. If each of us talks to 10 people by the end of this month, how many people does that mean we've spoken to? How many people are here today? 10 times as many people as are here today already. So we've all got to see ourselves as part of the solution. We are the people who have to start talking about these things.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine. And we've only got about 5 minutes left, so my final sort of few minutes of discussion are going to be with you, Gemma, as both as the chair of this network, but also, you know, you gave that presentation about your No Barriers Here project when you know, talking with people with learning disabilities on advanced care planning. How, and we've heard and seen a lot about what people are achieving within this field, how working together helps people to move things forward. But I sometimes wonder, how much do we have to make things complicated and do things differently because of people with learning, because people have a learning disability? Do you know what I mean? I mean, I was quite struck by, you know, even for example, me talking to Peter, you know, explaining about the person dying, how able many people are in discussing this and thinking about it. And Mark, you said the same. You said I had this discussion and actually it was remarkably easy. So I sometimes wonder whether we're too worried and too cautious about, you know, approaching this topic with people. So I'm just going to stop talking there, Gemma, and give you the floor for a few minutes.
Thank you, Irena. I think it's what we spoke about the last 10-15 minutes, isn't it? It's those misconceptions that speaking about deaf and dying with people with learning disabilities that we shouldn't do it, or that, you know, staff haven't got the confidence to do it. And for me, with the No Barriers Here project, it was about taking it right down to community level with people who are well, they don't currently access palliative and end-of-life care, and making it a normal part of everyday conversation. So the conversations around what matters, and, you know, agree with Mark, that's quite easy to do. It's quite easy to ask people what's important to them. You know, so and by using art, we took it outside of a medical environment, away from the medical approach. So it really did, it challenged those barriers, and it started to break down the inequalities. And what was really interesting is throughout all 3 workshops, it was actually staff members that struggled, not from the palliative perspective, but from the learning disability perspective. So 2 support workers actually couldn't finish the workshop. They found it too traumatic to think about their own end of life and what they wanted. And yet the people with learning disabilities, and, you know, I know Vincent's part of No Barriers Here is now part of your grassroots group, but just so that everybody is aware, when we started the project, Vincent never spoke about deaf and dying before. This has all happened in the last 12 months. They really embraced it. And it was easy. We had to adapt things, so we produced easy read materials. We also produced videos to do the different art activities, but we did it. And I think, like I said at the start, you know, it's that co-production that brings the additional value as well to this work. So I think for anybody that's considering either doing a project or doing something new within their field, you've got to be working alongside people with learning disabilities. You've got to be working right in communities doing it, and almost leaving professional hats at the front door sometimes.
Thanks, Gemma. And I think I'm sorry, we're going to have to wrap this discussion up very soon, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to give everybody on the panel really sufficient time to talk more. I just want to sort of finish by saying how much, you know, the work we do with people with learning disabilities, what they're teaching us about communication and about how to approach things, how much that can help all of us. And an example of that, Gemma, is I was part of your No Barriers Here workshop, and I was allowed to do the artwork along with everybody else. It really helped me as well. So I think the things that we know about how to support people with learning disabilities at the end of life, towards the end of life, throughout their lives, would actually help all of us. So I think all of you watching this this conference, you know, go out and spread the word, and not just to people with learning disabilities, but to all people, you know, with or without learning disabilities. They could all benefit from the wonderful work we do. So I'm going to wrap that up and leave it there. Thank you very much for attending this conference. I hope it was useful. As I said earlier, I'm going to reach over again and show you once more the Linda Meckenhill Award, which I'll cover it up to the winner for this evening, which we will be announcing tonight. So do come, it's free, 7 o'clock, and do sign up for that. In the meantime, I hope that this was useful, and keep coming back, keep spreading the word. We're going to end, in case you've missed it, at lunchtime we showed you a video of the highlights of the PCPLD network over the past year, and we'll just finish by showing that again, I hope, if it's lined up. Thank you very much.
welcome to our webinar today.
Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar.
We're amazed at the sheer number of you joining this webinar, as over 2,000 people are registered.
I hope you enjoy it and you may learn something from it.
But not everybody thinks like that.
I agree with what Pat said as well. People do grieve in different ways.
It's not an easy subject to talk about.
I really hate that D word. I hate it.
I knew then that she wasn't going to get better.
And Carol died. She took her last breath. And there was a silence in the room, and
well, we knew that Victoria was going to die, and we knew we had time to prepare for this.
And then you said, and then I have to ask you, should or shouldn't we resuscitate your daughter? This was so unexpected for me, that question.
At 33, from constipation, he died. I wailed like a wounded animal.
That beautiful smile, that sense of humour, and those wise words of wisdom, they were gone forever. My boy was silenced.
Not only are they at high risk of catching the virus, but once they catch it, they're at very high risk of not getting the care that they need. We need to have the vaccine immediately.
How has it been for you seeing people dying of COVID?
You just spoke about your father dying. I'm really sorry about that. You know, it must have been very, very hard for you.
I do think you're brilliant. And I think that you should be really proud of everything that you've done this year, because you've managed to help teach the rest of us what we should be doing. So
we hope you've enjoyed this webinar.
I hope you found it useful.
I hope to see you again next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
I think people with a learning disability should get the vaccination because it will. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Sorry. Oh. I don't know. Just. Yes. Yes. I think it. Oh. It's a good thing. I'll call him back. Sorry.